So this is a makeup for Friday of this week. Hopefully you've seen the Stories from the Stone Age documentary, and this is just to kind of get us up to speed in terms of origins of agriculture in Europe. So Wednesday we were talking about the fact that some of the ideas to explain how agriculture rose and spread were migration of people from the Middle East into Europe, bringing along agriculture. That's called the migration theory. Next explanation is that through trade, ideas and also some of the domesticated plants and animals moved into Europe. And then the last idea is that people in Europe developed agriculture independently with their own ideas, and that's sort of the independent invention model. And the reality is that all three were at play, and we're going to see evidence for that. So the very earliest agriculture in Europe is in the southeast, right, near modern-day Turkey. So you can see that it is the closest region in Europe to the region where agriculture developed. But the spread of agriculture in Europe is earlier than people originally thought, right? And also they realize now that some of the domesticated animals in Europe had wild ancestors in Europe as well. They didn't all come from the Near East, as we're going to see. Okay, so Greece and the Balkans area, the area right near the Middle East, had the earliest evidence for agriculture, and that's around 6000 BC. And what they found is a tell site called a Grisamagula, and it's just like a Near Eastern site, mud brick architecture. The climate of Greece is very similar, almost identical to the climate of Western Turkey. So that whole region has this Mediterranean climate. So the settlements in the southeast of Europe, right, were very similar to the settlements in the Middle East, right? Similar climate, similar animals, things like that. So once agriculture is established in Europe around 6000 BC, then it starts to spread to other areas of Europe, right? So you can see spreading upwards, right, into Central and then eventually into Northern Europe, and then you could see along this the Mediterranean into Spain, what's now Spain and France. We're really going to focus on this upward, this northern migration, because as these communities, right, start moving north, they enter Central Europe, which is a very different climate from southeastern Europe. Right here, it's Mediterranean, hot, dry, but wet enough for agriculture. Whereas when you get into Central Europe, we're talking about the climate that we're used to in Michigan, heavily forested area, colder. Right, the agricultural cycle is different, right, because you're getting real winters. You're not getting sort of rainy winters, which allows the crops to grow. You have a much shorter growing season. You've got dense forests, so farmers moving into this area have several challenges. And so their culture, the archaeological culture of people in Central and Northern Europe, is different than the culture of people in Southeastern Europe. How are they getting up north? Well, not surprisingly, farms were close to water. They used the water for agriculture, and so essentially what they were doing is they were following the course of one of the most important rivers in Europe, and that is the Danube. So as things got crowded, some villagers might break off and form a new village a little bit further north on the Danube River, right? And then as, let's say, maybe they used resources there and the population maybe got a little bit too big, or for whatever reasons, some people migrated and established villages on the further north on the Danube. And so we're talking about over 600 years to 1,000 years, they eventually made their way up into Northern Europe. So this was not a generational thing. This was not in a few generations. This took a long time of basically just slowly moving up into Europe, and their culture changed. The other important aspect is when you have farmers living here, in the woods around them are still hunters and gatherers, right? So agriculture and hunting and gathering is existing side by side at the same time in Europe, and especially Central and Northern Europe. Right? Okay, so the first agricultural people in Central and Northern Europe, not in Southeastern Europe, but the first agricultural people in Central and Northern Europe, right? We're talking now Germany, Czechoslovakia, right? Are what are known as the band ceramic culture. And again, archaeologists are not very good at naming things. They found some ceramics in these early settlements that were decorated with bands. Germans were excavating it, hence they called them the band ceramic people. And this is around 5,000 to 4,000 BC. And they're building villages. They're clearing forests for agriculture, building villages, about 40 to 60 people, and we'll see some of the evidence for some of that. Right, over time, because we're talking about several hundred years, genetic changes in people also take place. And today, when you're talking about lactose tolerance and lactose intolerance, right, people in Northern Europe, right, more of them are lactose tolerant than not, right? So about 80% of the population of Northern Europe, people from Northern Europe, they're lactose tolerant, right? When you get down to the Middle East, people who are lactose tolerant, 40%, and then under 20%. And why is that? Well, a lot of scientists believe there was some selection for a genetic trait that coded for people to have lactose tolerance in Northern Europe. Why? Well, it was an advantage. And why was it an advantage? Because this is a much more extreme climate. And so if their crops failed for a year, or if they weren't getting enough food from plants, those who could live off cow's milk would survive. Those who were lactose intolerant, right, who would get gastrointestinal trouble, couldn't digest the milk, and therefore couldn't live off of it, they would not survive and they would not pass down their genes. So through selection, we end up with people in Northern Europe having more lactose tolerance than people down in Southeastern Europe or the Middle East. Okay. Another important finding, and you read some of this on Blackboard, is I looked at pig DNA of ancient domesticates in Europe. And what they saw is that the first domesticated pigs genetically could be traced back to the Middle East. Right? That is, pigs were brought from the Middle East. Eventually, those pigs, had progeny, etc. That breed of pigs made its way with humans up to Northern Europe. Later on, what they find is that domesticated pigs have a European origin. Right? That is, people in Northern Europe had become used to the idea of agriculture and experience with domestication, then took those ideas and applied it to wild pigs in Europe and domesticated those pigs. Right? And so, again, a mixture of diffusion of Middle Eastern pigs and then independent invention of the domestication of local European pigs. Right? So again, this kind of shows you that the story is a little bit complicated. Right. This is what a band ceramic village looked like. Right? It's 40 to 60 people building long houses. Right? And we'll continue with this